Hello, in this lesson I will talk about the color rings in the 3D LUT Creator. Color rings are RGB curves only with a different interface. To open the color rings, you need to open the Curves tab and choose them in the Curves menu. In 3D LUT Creator, there are two types of color rings. These are Offset Gamma Gain rings and Shadow-Midtone-Highlights rings. Let's start with the latter. To better understand how color rings work, I will turn on the 3D LUT Curves Analyzer and move the cursor to a neutral color, for example to the background. This analyzer shows the curves that will be written to the final 3D LUT, so you can immediately see what curves are created by the rings. So let's look at the interface. There are 3 color rings. Each ring allows you to adjust the color within its brightness range. Under the color rings, there are 3 sliders that allow you to adjust the range of rings effect. And also there are 2 gradients. Now both gradients are gray, so they look like one, but if I move anything, the lower gradient changes. I painted the shadows in red, which is clearly visible on the gradient. The analyzer shows how the LUT curves changed. I grade this image. I will make the midtones cooler and add green to the highlights. That's what I got. Before, after. The gradient shows the color I'm adding. You can also change the brightness using color rings. To do this, you need press Shift key and drag the mouse on the selected point up or down. I will make the shadow darker. Keep in mind that color rings are based on RGB curves, so if you adjust the brightness too much, you can lose the contrast or get artifacts. Let's say I make the midtones much brighter and the highlights darker. The curves of the red and green channels became horizontal, and the blue curve even has a negative slope. So I lost the details in the highlights. Also, when you change the brightness and color, you need to ensure that none of the image channels go beyond the limits of dynamic range. Otherwise, you can get clipping or crush the shadows. This is clearly seen on the waveform analyzer. For example, I will move the highlights to the blue and clip the blue channel. This is clearly visible on the waveform. To fix it, I press the Shift key and drag the mouse down on the highlights point. That is, I'll make the highlights darker. You can do it the other way. Move the slider responsible for the highlights range to the left until the effect of the highlights ring is gone. Look at the shape of the curves. Right and left sliders are used to set blacks and whites protection range, while the middle slider is used to set the midtones location. Such type of color rings is well suited for beginners because it's easier to get the right shade using them. But it is easier to get artifacts, so professional colorists prefer to use the other color rings, which are called the Offset Gamma Gain. Let's see how they work. The offset shifts the image curves upward or downward without changing their slope. This is very clearly visible on the Curves Analyzer and on the vector scope. The offset changes color and brightness of the whole image, in the shadows, midtones, and highlights. The gamma changes the gamma curve of the image. It impacts mainly the shadows and midtones. The gain shifts the white point of the curves. The black point remains unchanged. Gain mostly affects highlights. Rings are convenient to stretch the picture to the entire dynamic range and adjusting the white balance. I set the black point with the offset. Now with the help of the gain ring, I will correct the white balance in the highlights. I will make them neutral. If the highlights are neutral, the upper bounds of the channel on the waveform should match. That's what I got. You can also pull the highlights to the upper border of the dynamic range. Before and after. Let's turn to another example. I will grade this image. And as a reference, I'll take a shot from the movie that you all know. This is how reference looks like on the waveform and my image. I make the shadows darker and paint them in green. I will paint the midtones and highlights. The color applies better to the desaturated image. So I go to the Sat Loom curve and decrease the saturation in the shadows. And I add some greener tint. Also note that deep shadows on the reference remain black. To remove the tint from the shadows, you can move the left slider, which is responsible for the shadows, to the right until you get the look you like. To make the finished look, I also desaturate the highlights. I will do it on the Sat Loom curve. Here is the image before, there is the after. I hope you understand that the original film has much more complex color grading than just a simple toning. If the image contains highly saturated colors, the toning will not repaint them. In this case, the red lips of the girl are knocked out. By the way, in the original film, the red color is also preserved, and it can be seen on the reference, so I leave it as it is. And that's it. Now it's your turn to grade. See you in the next video. Bye!